Many people must have walked or driven past this building near the cemetery on Bell Road and not given it too much thought. When I did think about it, I assumed it must have been built as a grand residence, and indeed it has hosted royalty. But in fact its beginnings were very humble.
It is recorded that on the 4th of September 1866 that Sittingbourne Baptist Church was born, when, in the presence of 11 witnesses, the 13 founder members covenanted together in the house of George Hambrook Dean, who was its first deacon. This house was called Whitehall, Bell Road in Sittingbourne. 32-year-old George Dean must have only just moved here with his wife and young family, and early maps from 1865 show a pair of semi-detached houses, probably farm cottages, in this area of park and farmland known as Whitehall. George Dean was an entrepreneur, a farmer, brickmaker and cement manufacturer. He had acquired the site recently and was already set to become one of Sittingbourne's most prominent landowners and businessmen. Looking at maps and images of the semi-detached Whitehall here around the turn of the century, we can be almost certain that the old cottages shown on the maps of the 1860s had been demolished, and this was new, grander accommodation. Local historian Canon Scott Robertson, writing in the late 19th century, said that a field, parts of which are now occupied by Sittingbourne Cemetery and by the house in which I reside, has for centuries been called Whitehall. From 1871 to at least 1881, Canon Scott Robertson lived in one of these two houses, and G.H. Dean lived next door. Census records George Hambrook Dean as living in the north of the pair of houses. The shady side, I suppose you could say. George Dean became chairman of the Smead-Dean Empire, which produced bricks by the million. The company also built and operated barges to transport bricks to London, where they were used to build or rebuild such structures as King's Cross Station, many of the docks and Buckingham Palace. George Dean was also a magistrate.
In 1891 he had the Whitehall Preserve Works built here just up the road, known informally as the Jam Factory. It was a natural extension to the farming operation. There were also oast houses there, and you have to remember that this was a very rural area. This was in fact on the very edge of Sittingbourne.
By 1891 Scott Robertson had moved on, and James Holbert, the shopkeeper and council chairman from 1895 to 1906, lived in one of the two houses.
By 1896 it looks as though George had donated a bit of land from the Whitehall site, and the cemetery had in fact been extended round behind the two houses.
Incidentally, the boundary between Sittingbourne and Milton crosses the site. The Preserve Works buildings to the south were actually on the Milton side of the boundary. On this 1897 map you can see the boundary between Milton and Sittingbourne. By around 1908, G.H. Dean and his second wife Jane were the only occupants listed with their staff, and it was a substantial and grand house with 7 bedrooms, a drawing room, a dining room, a breakfast room, conservatory, bathroom and kitchen. There were gardens and stables, garage and a coach house. At the outbreak of the First World War, by December 1914, the house was taken on and run by the Red Cross as a Voluntary Aid Detachment Hospital, a VAD hospital. Capacity was 104 beds, and thousands of wounded Allied troops were treated there. Many tents and additional temporary buildings were put up in the grounds and across the road. The hospital was presided over by Olympia Letitia Honeyball, wife of a Tenham farmer and part-time soldier. The hospital eventually closed in 1919.
In 1921 the house was again the home of Mr. and Mrs. Dean, and as major business leaders in the area they hosted the Duke of York when he was on a visit here to Rainham, Sittingbourne and Milton Regis.
The future King George VI was here to visit local industry, including agriculture, brickfields and paper mills. His party was hosted for lunch here at Whitehall by the Deans. George Hambrook Dean died in 1924. In 1939, this was again certainly two homes, with civil engineer Livingston Randerson living in the former Dean residence with his wife, and next door on the southern side was retired Sittingbourne house furnisher, auctioneer and undertaker Alfred Reynolds with his wife. There was an atmosphere of quiet order in this stately building when Swale Rural District Council was in occupation in the 1960s, until the creation of Swale Borough Council in 1974. The accommodation far outranked the former club rooms over the tailor's shop in the High Street and the various houses dotted around the town occupied by Swale RDC's urban district colleagues. In the mid to late 70s, the buildings were occasionally used by the NHS for vaccinations and clinics. Photographs in 1983 appear to show the buildings and those temporary structures in the backyard as unused, and this is probably the time that the council decided to sell the property. It was then sold and converted into residential apartments, and new houses were built on the garden at the back of the two homes.
And it remains today a building divided into several apartments or flats, but it retains, as you can see, its rather elegant appearance.
If you have found this video interesting, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or visit our website.